Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Doug Bradburn and Rick Atkinson.
Yes. For Rick, please. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I used to teach college classes right after lunch. I'm used to the sleeping, but I know you won't, because we got an incredible session coming up here, and it's going to be a lot of fun. First, Rick and I are going to have a conversation, then he's going to get to turn the tables and ask some other questions, not to me, but more interesting people. So, Rick Atkinson, I consider you one of the greatest living writers on war in American history. Why do you write stories about war?
Well, thank you for that, Doug. I write about war because I think it's the essence of who we are as a species. It's the essence of who we are as a country. I think that understanding our military history generally is vital. It's as vital as understanding any other important aspect of our history. I write about it. I grew up in it. My father was an Army officer. I spent 18 years as a dependent in the Army. And as a journalist, I wrote about military issues a lot. I spent time in places like Somalia and Iraq and Bosnia. And I write about it as an author because I think that for Americans to have a sense of where we're going, it's important for them to understand the sacrifices that have been made to get here for almost 250 years now. And the sacrifices are immense. And part of my job as an author is to remind people of the suffering. And war is suffering, not just by soldiers, but by everyone who's involved. And you know that today, looking at Ukraine, looking at what's happening in Israel and areas in the Middle East. And I think it's important for people to remember that we got to where we are today, largely through the sacrifices of those who are involved.
Why does it matter to our democracy, or the great experiment, that our country had to win its independence in war?
Well, we had to go to war because the Brits, stubborn as they are, wouldn't allow us to just slip out the back door. You know, the crucible of war, and it was a long war, 1775 to 1783, that crucible, for one thing, welded the country into what it was going to be after 1783. It gave us an identity to a large extent. It gave us a sense of common purpose, a sense that we could have common purpose, that we could move forward collectively. And, you know, Doug, you see over and over again through the course of the revolution, aspirations. In the winter after Valley Forge, the winter of 1778-79, in the middle of February 1779, the Army is encamped in northern New Jersey. And Henry Knox, the head of Continental Artillery, the father of American artillery, held a celebration, the one-year anniversary of the alliance with the French, February 18th. And as the guests arrived, and there were mostly Army officers, but there were a lot of women in the camp, including Martha Washington, they passed through 13 arches. And the arches all had illuminated illustrations of various aspects of the war. So there was the first shots at Lexington, and then there was the glory of Saratoga. There were the towns that were immolated by the British, like Falmouth and Esopus. And as they moved through this, the last of these 13 arches was a depiction of what was titled Rising Empire. And it was the America they were trying to bring into being. They were trying to midwife this new country. And it depicted rivers covered with ships and canals traversing the land. And that speaks to their idea of what the place could become. And I think that aspirational quality of the revolution is very important to understanding the revolution itself, but also who they were.
One of the comments earlier in the discussions, the wonderful discussions we had last night and earlier today, was the idea of finding a cause
came from, what our forebears believed. Whether you arrived in America, your ancestors arrived in the 17th century or 3 weeks ago. But the most fundamental thing that it reveals to us is what they're willing to die for. That is the most profound question any people can ask themselves. What are you willing to die for? And this question is put to them over and over again, because it doesn't get any realer than that. The number of deaths in the American Revolution, proportion to the population, is larger than any of our wars other than the Civil War. So that fundamental question, what are you willing to die for? And that's something that in 2023 we should reflect on, about their answer to that question. And their answer to that question is essentially, I'm willing to die for you. Because they're thinking about generations unborn. It's a phrase that Washington uses repeatedly. Generations unborn, that's us. And they're willing to die for it. That's a pretty profound thing.
Well, so you started out writing about 20th century wars and later, and then you find yourself traveling back into the 18th century. What were some of the things that surprised you about the American Revolutionary War, maybe based on what you had preconceptions you might have had, or things that you found were really familiar?
I'm gobsmacked, to use the British term, by the British. Trying to understand what it is they think they're doing by waging war against their own people for 8 years across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail is really fascinating and very difficult to get to the bottom of it. You know, you have to understand where the British are coming from in order to understand the revolution. Why is it being fought? What do they think they're doing? What does George III think he's doing? Because he's largely driving the train. You know, the essence of what the British government has decided as of 1775 is that the new empire that has been created with the British victory over the French and Spanish in what we call the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, will dissipate if they permit colonies, most prominently the American colonies, to break away. That will be the end of the empire. This is wrong. They're told by people like Adam Smith. Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. Adam Smith tells them quite clearly, as one of the greatest economic thinkers in history, that's not how it works. That's not how economies work. But that falls on deaf ears, and consequently for 8 years, an immense cost in British blood and treasure, they're going to fight this war and they're going to lose. So I'm fascinated by the other side of the hill, the British side of the hill.
One of the advantages you had, I think, in the early stages of your research was the opening of the Georgian archives, the papers at Windsor Castle. Mount Vernon's been a part of that. You went with the Omohundro Institute as a fellow there. Talk a little bit about folks here who may not know about that archive and how it impacted your thinking.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and I was very lucky. Well, the Georgian papers, the papers of the 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries, are owned by, at that time, they were owned by Queen Elizabeth. They're now owned by Charles. But Elizabeth was persuaded.
That's how monarchies work. It goes to the sun.
It's not that messy. You just hand it over to your kin.
Easy.
The Queen was persuaded to allow the papers to be digitized, because there had been a bad fire at Windsor, and the papers are kept at Windsor, and to allow scholars in to take a look at it. And there are others who were also there who are here today. So I was there. I was permitted to come for the month of April 2016, which happened to be the month the Queen turned 90. So Windsor was one hop in town. And part of the issue in digitizing was they didn't really know what they had in those papers. Nobody had ever gone through. Now, of the papers, about 300,000 pages had never been published. Most of the papers belonged to George III because he was king for 60 years. So every day I would flash my badge at the Henry VIII gate and flash my badge again at the Norman gate, and then up 102 stone steps and up 21 wooden stairs to the top of the round tower begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And that's where the papers are kept.
Seems secure.
As secure as a castle can make them. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. He wrote not only his correspondence himself, he made the copies himself. He's a great list maker, lists of, theater productions that he'd seen. And so going through...
He'd been perfect for our top 10 list fascination today, right? He'd been a leading memer.
That's right, yes. Yeah, just don't let him get on Twitter. And the papers are, some of them have been published, but a lot have not. And you have this tactile sense of being in his presence because these are the pages he wrote. And you can really discern a lot about, in this case, George, about his family. He writes a lot to Queen Charlotte, this sort of drab, obscure German princess that he's married 6 hours after they met. He had.
You clearly haven't seen Bridgerton. I mean, that's she's much more interesting than that.
He decorated the wedding bedroom with many, many yards of blue damask and large bowls of goldfish, because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish, right?
I'm sorry for Jane, your wife. Well, so it's your first book. So you're writing a trilogy on the American Revolutionary War, which will be the definitive narrative history of the war for our generation. Thank you for doing that. You didn't have to do it. You felt like you owed it to us, right? So you're going to do it.
Yep.
The first book was a phenomenal success. Where are we at with the second book? I mean,
You sound like a publisher.
What is the subject of the second volume of the trilogy? Where does it begin and where does it end?
It begins in the spring of 1777, which is where the first book ends, and it will end in May of 1780 with the fall of Charleston. The British capture Charleston. They capture the entire army there, 5,000 men. It's a catastrophe.
So it's called The Empire Strikes Back, the second volume?
Yeah, well, there's a lot that happens in there. There's, Brandywine in Germantown and Saratoga and the capture and then surrender of Philadelphia. And I'm about 3/4 of the way done with the manuscript. I'm hoping to be finished by the end of the winter.
Well, one of the things that you're really incredible on in the first book, and you've been very helpful to Mount Vernon in many ways on the question of leadership. And since we got this big picture of a general behind you, what did you see in Washington's leadership as you started to do your research and you're trying to write it out in the context of telling that story? What are some things that strikes you?
I had the privilege of spending 15 years metaphorically with Dwight Eisenhower and writing about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II and the Mediterranean European theaters. So 15 years with Dwight Eisenhower, and I learned a lot about Eisenhower as a general. I don't know anything about him as a president. And now I'm in the same relationship with Washington. And they're quite similar in some ways, despite the fact that they're completely different in their backgrounds. And their leadership skills overlap in certain fundamental ways. They have a good eye, both of them, for subordinate talent. They have executive minds organized for executive action. They're very articulate, both orally and in writing. We think of Eisenhower as kind of this mumbling. He's not that. Churchill at one point says, after he's listened to Eisenhower, he says, good generals do not usually have such powers of expression as he has. Washington is the same way. You never come away from a session with Washington without any doubt about what the commander's intent is. So the clarity of their thinking, the clarity of their expression, their physical durability. Washington never seems to catch cold over the course of 18 years. It's not physically accurate, but he's very durable. And Eisenhower, despite smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day in 1944, he's the same, and it projects robustness in the captain on the ship. Their ability to roll with the vicissitudes. Things are very, very dark for Washington in particular, and they're dark for Eisenhower at certain points. To have a sense that, okay, tomorrow we're going to get at him again. Neither of them, neither Washington nor Eisenhower, are particularly good tactical commanders. They don't see the battlefield spatially and temporally the way a great captain does, the way our 3 generals here would. They're not Napoleon. And they have moments of strategic insight and great competence, but for the most part, they're not great strategists either. But in Washington's case, his ability to get up the next morning and keep on doing it. He writes a letter, you and I have talked about this, he writes a letter in 1780, sends it home here to Mount Vernon to Lunt, Washington, his cousin who's his overseer, and things are pretty dark in the summer of 1780. And he says, you ask, what will be my reward for all this? And I'm paraphrasing him now. And he says, it's the certain knowledge that I have done my best, that I've left it all out there. And that if this enterprise, the war, is not successful, it will not be because of any want of effort on my part. That's true. So I think that's a pretty remarkable aspect of his leadership. It's a determination that we're going to see this through, and I'm going to leave it all on the line, and I expect you to do it too. That's why men followed him for years through misery, because of this sense of his projecting both confidence and determination.
One of the hallmarks of American democracy is that we've had civilian control of the military. It is a fundamental value that all Americans across parties share. It has to be taught and inculcated. And George Washington, of course, walked the walk in the Revolution. Why did he do that? What was his relationship like with the Continental Congress? And how did you see that evolve in your work?
Well, it's one of the most interesting relationships in American history. He invents the notion of civilian control of the military. It's not in the manual.
Humphrey Bland, it's not in there?
No, it's not there. Right from the get-go, right from the time he takes over the Continental Army in July of 1775 in Cambridge, he acknowledges the superiority of his civilian masters. He writes dozens and dozens of letters in those first months as commander of the Continental Army to Congress, to state, they're not states yet, but they will be states in the summer of 1776, but to colonial governments, to committees of safety, to movers and shakers. And the underlying thesis of all this correspondence is basically, I am your servant. I am here. Now, he can be very hard on the masters, and he can be manipulative. But he basically is acknowledging two things. One, I see your concern about this thing you've created, a Continental Army. I know that you know who Cromwell was. They're very aware of English history. And I am here to tell you that we will not threaten what it is you're trying to build. He's pretty direct about it. This is something that he reassures Congress in particularly over and over again. His relationship with Congress is rocky. You know, in that same winter that I was talking about when they're in North Jersey in 1778-79, he shows up at camp and he writes a letter to one of his Virginia pals and says, first of all, it's the first time that he has been with the entire Congress for 3 years. And he says, where are all our great men? Where is Jefferson? Where is Mason? Why aren't they here? Because of the 50-some who are there, only I think 12 or 13 had been there when he had last been together with Congress. And some of these are small men, believe it or not, in Congress. And it's a cross for him to bear, to deal with these guys. He thinks he's going to be in Philadelphia that winter only for a few days, and he's there for 6 weeks because there's a lot of business to attend to, and part of it is to deal with Congress and to make Congress see that, we need to work together on this. So it's a fraught relationship.
It's an extraordinary letter. When we were talking about it earlier, I was delighted to know that you had focused in on that one because it's such a moment of frustration and speaks to it. The civilian control of the military, you don't do that because you think the civilians are always right or very good even at what they're doing. You do it for a higher purpose. And Washington, all these revolutionary generals of all the great revolutions, they think they know what to do best, and he did know what to do, but he had to defer to these small men, as you say.
Right. Yeah. No. It's a difficult cup that he's trying to swallow sometimes, and he builds. He's a very good politician.
Yeah.
He builds relationships with those who can help him to get to achieve his objectives. So he becomes close to the successor of John Hancock as the president of Congress, Henry Lawrence. You've all seen Hamilton. John Lawrence is a character. Henry's his father, and Henry is the president of Congress. He also, by the way, was the largest slave trader in America. That's where the Lawrence fortune came from in South Carolina. But Henry Lawrence has a lot of things going for him, and among other things, he recognizes that Washington is extraordinarily competent. He recognizes that the way to win this war is through Washington. And so Washington builds an alliance with him. And he does that over and over again, not only with members of Congress, but with state governments and with people who can help him to achieve what he's trying to achieve. Even if it's, I need 5,000 bushels of wheat. My soldiers are starving to death. Please send me 5,000 bushels of wheat. He's really down in the weeds on a lot of things. He has his own staff initially. He does it all. Clothier, master, general. He's his intelligence chief through the whole war. So he is very much in the weeds of running his army. But then on the strategic level, dealing with Congress and others who are essential to making the war successful.
So as we're getting ready to transition to another conversation, one of the great things about your writing is you are obviously adept at the leadership and the grand strategy and the context, but you also, I think, bring out the humanity and the reality for the common soldier very powerfully. What are some of the continuities you see in the experience of the soldiery of the American Revolution, World War II, even into Iraq? I know you were embedded there as well. What are some of the things that strikes you in the archive that come out that you recognize?
I think one of the things that I see is that for an infantryman, whether you're in the days of Thucydides or whether you're in Afghanistan in the 21st century or Iraq in the 21st century, infantry life is infantry life. And you are, a lot of things have changed in terms of weaponry and the education of the soldier or the Marine. But basically, the life is the life. And that includes why they do what they do. Why do they do this? And they do it not really because of, the Constitution, not because of the flag. Why do they risk what they risk, which in some cases is everything? They do it for each other. The abiding love of soldier for soldier, Marine for Marine, is an extraordinarily powerful thing. It blooms on a battlefield. And to me, seeing that over the course of 250 years in our history is extraordinary. It's reassuring in a lot of ways. But that's one aspect in which there is a through line that goes from that Continental Army soldier right through member of the Air Force, Navy, Marines, Army today.
Well, when can we expect this next volume?
The publisher again.
I'm gonna clear my reading list. I'm ready.
The plan is 2025 is in the beginning of the semi-quincentennial. I think most.
You heard there's a big anniversary coming.
I heard that. I heard that.
There's the disinterestedness that we're looking for, right? Well, let's give him a big round of applause as we transition here. Thanks.